The summer heat in Marfa, Texas hit like a physical wall the moment anyone stepped outside. By 10 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed to 98 degrees, turning the small West Texas town into a shimmering mirage of adobe buildings and endless desert horizon. On the corner of Highland Avenue and San Antonio Street, directly in front of the Rio Grande Valley Bank, stood the most unusual sight Marfa had witnessed in decades. A massive albino bull tied to the bank's decorative hitching post. A relic from when the building had been a general store in the 1890s, the bull was enormous, easily 2,000 pounds of pure muscle, with a coat so white it seemed to glow in the brutal Texas sun. His horns curved forward slightly, pale ivory tipped with pink. His eyes, unsettling pink eyes with no pigment, watched the street with calm intelligence. Everything about him screamed genetic anomaly, the kind of animal that nature rarely produced and the cattle industry almost never valued. Cars slowed as they passed. Pedestrians crossed to the other side of the street. One elderly woman made the sign of the cross, muttering something about El Diablo Blanco, the white devil. Parents pulled their children closer, as if the bull's albinism might be contagious. The bull didn't react to any of it. He simply stood there, patient and still, his lead rope secured to the post with a knot that showed someone had actually known what they were doing. A dented metal water bucket sat beside him, half full. Someone had cared enough to make sure he wouldn't dehydrate in the killing heat. Inside the bank, the air conditioning was set to Arctic levels, a stark contrast to the inferno outside. The Rio Grande Valley Bank was small, serving a town of fewer than 2,000 permanent residents. It had 4 teller windows, a vault from 1952 that the manager loved to brag about, and exactly 1 ATM positioned near the entrance. The manager, Javier Delgado, sat in his glass-walled office reviewing loan applications with the enthusiasm of a man doing anything to avoid actual work. At 47, Javier had worked at this bank for 23 years, climbing from teller to assistant manager to manager through a combination of competence and the simple fact that nobody else wanted the job in a town this small. Javier prided himself on knowing everyone in Marfa. He knew who could be trusted with credit and who couldn't. He knew which ranchers were one bad season from bankruptcy and which ones were sitting on oil money they pretended not to have. He knew the gossip, the secrets, the financial reality behind every storefront on Highland Avenue. Which is why, when the boy walked through the bank's glass doors, Javier immediately noticed and immediately judged. The kid was maybe 12 years old, skinny as a fence post, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that screamed poverty. His t-shirt had a faded logo from some rodeo 3 years past. His jeans were too short, showing bony ankles above boots that were held together more by duct tape than leather. His skin was brown from sun and heritage, his face smudged with dust. But it was his eyes that struck Javier, dark brown, intense, focused with a determination that didn't belong in someone so young. The boy walked straight toward the ATM without acknowledging anyone. The 2 tellers, Carmen and Rosa, watched him with the polite wariness bank employees reserve for customers they can't quite categorize. The security guard, Miguel Santos, a 60-year-old retired police officer who worked part-time, shifted his weight, suddenly more alert. Javier stood up from his desk and walked out of his office, drawn by curiosity and something else. The opportunity to assert authority. There was something about the kid's confidence that irritated him, as if someone that young and obviously poor had no business walking into a bank like he belonged there. "Excuse me," Javier said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make it clear this wasn't a friendly greeting. "Can I help you?" The boy paused, turning to face the manager. "No, thank you. I just need to use the ATM." His voice was steady, polite, but there was no deference in it. No apology for existing in a space where he clearly didn't fit. Javier's irritation increased. "That's your bull outside?" The question was designed to embarrass, to establish the absurdity of the situation. What kind of child brought livestock to a bank? "Yes, sir. That's Blanco." Blanco. Javier couldn't help the smirk that crossed his face. "You do realize you can't bring animals to a bank, right? This isn't a rodeo. He's not inside the bank, sir. He's tied outside legally to a public hitching post." Javier's smirk faltered. The kid was technically correct. The hitching post was original to the building and had never been officially removed from public use, though nobody had tied an animal to it in probably 50 years. Carmen, the senior teller, tried to defuse the situation. "Sir, is there something we can help the young man with?" But Javier was enjoying this too much to stop. "I'm just curious what a kid with a freak show bull needs at a bank." He looked directly at the boy. "You got a piggy bank you want to empty? Maybe $20 saved up from mowing lawns?" A few customers in line chuckled. Rosa, the younger teller, looked uncomfortable. Miguel, the security guard, frowned but didn't intervene. The boy didn't flinch. "I just want to check my balance, sir, that's all." "Your balance." Javier laughed outright now. "Kid, do you even have an account here?" "Yes, sir, under the name Mateo Reyes. Account established 3 years ago." Javier's laugh died slightly. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Mateo Reyes. Okay, and you need to check your balance." He gestured toward the ATM with exaggerated courtesy. "Be my guest, though I should warn you, there's a fee if you have less than $500 in the account." "I'm aware of the fee structure, sir." The kid's calm was starting to unnerve Javier, though he'd never admit it. There was something off about this situation, something he couldn't quite identify. But pride and audience, the other customers were watching now, entertained by the exchange, pushed him forward. Mateo walked to the ATM. He pulled a worn wallet from his back pocket and extracted a bank card that looked like it had been through a washing machine at least twice. He inserted it into the machine, shielding the keypad with his hand as he entered his PIN. Javier moved closer, unable to resist. "This I gotta see," he muttered to Carmen, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Kid probably has $50 and thinks that makes him a customer worth taking seriously." The ATM screen loaded. There was a brief moment of digital processing, that eternal second where machines decide whether to grant access or deny it. Then, the screen changed. Mateo stepped back slightly, his hand still on the machine but his body language shifting, opening up as if inviting Javier to look. Which Javier did, because how could he resist? This was going to be the punchline to the perfect story he'd tell at the coffee shop later, the kid with the albino bull and his embarrassingly small bank account. Javier's eyes focused on the screen, on the numbers displayed there, on the account balance that couldn't possibly be real. His smile froze, then melted, then disappeared entirely. The blood drained from his face so quickly he actually swayed on his feet. That can't..." He blinked, certain he was misreading. But the numbers didn't change. They just sat there on the screen, undeniable and impossible. "Available balance, $847 through $340.17. The bank went silent. Not the polite quiet of people minding their own business, but the shocked silence of a room full of people who'd just witnessed something that defied their understanding of how the world worked. Carmen's hand flew to her mouth. Rosa dropped the deposit slip she'd been holding. Miguel straightened to his full height, suddenly seeing the boy in a completely different light. Outside, visible through the bank's large windows, the albino bull named Blanco turned his massive head toward the glass. His pink eyes seemed to focus on the interior of the bank, on the frozen tableau of adults who'd just had their assumptions shattered. He made a sound, not quite a bellow, more like a low rumble of satisfaction. Mateo looked up at Javier Delgado, the manager who'd mocked him, who'd called his bull a freak show, who'd assumed poverty and worthlessness based on appearance. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please," Mateo said quietly. "I need $18,000. Cash. I'm buying Blanco officially from Senor Herrera's estate. He wanted the payment in person." Javier opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. "Sir," Mateo prompted, "the withdrawal?" And that's when Javier Delgado realized he'd just made the most humiliating mistake of his 23-year banking career, and that every single person in the Rio Grande Valley Bank had witnessed it. Javier Delgado stood frozen, his brain struggling to reconcile what his eyes were showing him. $847,000 in the account of a 12-year-old boy wearing duct-taped boots. I need to verify this," Javier stammered, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Carmen, can you pull up account number?" He squinted at the ATM screen, his hands trembling slightly as he read the numbers. Carmen's fingers flew across her keyboard. 30 seconds of typing, then her face went pale. It's legitimate, Javier. The account was established 3 years ago under Mateo Reyes, with Vicente Reyes listed as custodian until... She scrolled down. Until Vicente's death 2 years ago. Then full control transferred to Mateo upon verification of identity and... She looked up at Javier, then at Mateo. This is a trust fund account. It's been sitting here for 3 years, and we never knew, Javier finished weakly. Mateo pulled his card from the ATM and returned it to his worn wallet. My grandfather didn't want people to know. He said money makes people treat you different, and he wanted me to grow up normal. He looked directly at Javier. Guess he was right about that. The implication hit Javier like a physical blow. Miguel, the security guard, coughed to hide what might have been a laugh. One of the customers, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, shook her head in disapproval, though whether at Javier or the situation wasn't clear. Your grandfather was Vicente Reyes? Rosa, the younger teller, spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a note of recognition. The Vicente Reyes who owned the cattle operation down in Presidio County? The one they called El Maestro? Mateo nodded. Yes, ma'am. He raised champion breeding stock in Mexico before he came to Texas. Spent 40 years building bloodlines that most people have never heard of because he sold private, not through auctions. Javier's mind raced, trying to remember what he knew about Vicente Reyes. The name was familiar, a reclusive rancher who died 2 years ago, leaving behind... What? Javier had never paid attention, because Vicente hadn't been a customer who needed loans or mortgages. He'd been self-sufficient, private, the kind of man who handled his business without banks when possible. I don't understand, Carmen said gently, her embarrassment at the situation evident. If you have all this money, why are you dressed like... She stopped herself, realizing how terrible it sounded. Like I'm poor? Mateo finished for her. Because my abuela Esperanza says money in the bank doesn't mean you waste it on expensive clothes that get torn up doing ranch work. And because my grandfather's will had conditions, I can access the money only for 3 purposes: education, medical emergencies, or continuing his legacy with cattle breeding. He looked at Javier again. Blanco is part of that legacy. My grandfather would have wanted me to save him. Blanco, Javier repeated, his voice hoarse. The albino bull outside. Yes, sir. He belonged to the Herrera family. When Señor Herrera died 6 months ago, his children wanted to get rid of Blanco. They said he was worthless. Defective genetics, no breeding value, just taking up space and resources. They were going to send him to slaughter next week. I offered to buy him, but they laughed at me. Said a kid couldn't afford a bull, even a worthless one. But he's not worthless, Miguel said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelation. The old security guard had grown up on ranches. He knew cattle. Is he? Mateo smiled for the first time since entering the bank, a smile that transformed his serious young face into something brighter. No, sir. Blanco carries bloodlines from my grandfather's champion breeding program. His father was Dominio, one of the greatest bulls my grandfather ever produced. But Dominio was sold to the Herreras 20 years ago, and they didn't keep good records. When Blanco was born albino, they assumed it was a genetic defect and stopped paying attention to his lineage. They never realized what they had. Albinism isn't a defect? Rosa asked, genuinely curious now. Not in this case. It's a rare recessive gene that appeared in one of my grandfather's original bloodlines. He spent decades trying to isolate it because bulls carrying that gene, even if they're not albino themselves, produce offspring with exceptional muscle development and disease resistance. Blanco is albino, which means he carries 2 copies of the gene. His calves will be incredibly valuable to the right breeders. The bank was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in the story. Even Javier, still reeling from his humiliation, found himself fascinated. How much are the Herreras asking? Miguel inquired. $18,000. They think they're overcharging me because I'm a kid. They don't know what he's actually worth. Mateo's expression hardened slightly. Which is why I need cash. Senor Herrera's son, Rafael, doesn't trust banks or transfers. He wants to see the money in person before he'll sign over the papers. Javier finally found his voice, though it came out much smaller than before. Mateo, I apologize. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions based on... He couldn't finish. There was no way to complete that sentence without making it worse. Based on how I look, Mateo said simply. It's okay, Senor Delgado. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. That's why my grandfather set things up this way. He wanted me to learn what people are really like before money changes how they see me. The words hung in the air. A 12-year-old teaching adults about human nature. Carmen stood up from her terminal. I'll prepare the withdrawal, $18,000 in cash. But Mateo, that's a lot of money to carry. Would you like Miguel to escort you? Mateo shook his head. No, thank you, ma'am. Blanco is my escort. Nobody's going to bother someone traveling with a 2,000-pound albino bull. Despite everything, several people smiled at that, including Miguel. As Carmen processed the withdrawal, counting out stacks of $100 bills in the back office, Javier approached Mateo. His earlier swagger was completely gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine humility. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was the best man I ever knew, Mateo said quietly. He died when I was 10. Lung cancer. I sat with him every day in the hospital, and he told me everything about his breeding program, about the bloodlines he'd created, about which bulls carried which genetic markers. Everyone thought he was just keeping me entertained, telling me stories. But he was teaching me everything he knew because he knew his children, my tios and tias, didn't care about the cattle. They only cared about selling off his ranch and splitting the money. Is that what happened? Yes, sir. They sold everything within 6 months of his death. The land, the equipment, most of the cattle. They would have sold Dominio too, but he'd already been sold to the Herreras years before. By the time I was old enough to do anything, it was all gone. Except the money he'd put aside for me, with instructions to rebuild what he'd created. Mateo looked out the window at Blanco, standing patient and still in the brutal heat. Blanco is the first piece. My grandfather's legacy starts again with him. Carmen returned with a bank envelope containing $18,000 in cash. Counted twice, verified, recorded. You'll need to sign here. Mateo signed with the careful precision of someone who'd practiced their signature. Carmen handed him the envelope, and he tucked it carefully into his backpack, a school bag that had probably cost $15 new and now looked like it had survived a war. As Mateo turned to leave, Javier called out one more time. Mateo? The boy turned back. I'm sorry, truly, and good luck with Blanco. Your grandfather would be proud. Mateo studied Javier for a long moment, as if deciding whether the apology was genuine. Finally, he nodded. Thank you, Senor Delgado. He walked out of the Rio Grande Valley Bank into the crushing Texas heat. Through the windows, everyone watched as he approached Blanco, untied the lead rope, and gently touched the massive bull's white face. Blanco lowered his head, accepting the touch, and together they walked down Highland Avenue, a small boy with a fortune in his backpack and a genetic miracle at his side. Inside the bank, Javier Delgado sat down heavily in his chair, his face still pale. He'd worked in banking for 23 years, thought he knew how to read people, thought he understood the world. Today, a 12-year-old in duct-taped boots had taught him how little he actually knew. The Herrera ranch sat 15 miles outside Marfa, a sprawling property that had seen better days. Wooden fences sagged with neglect, paint peeled from the barn, and the main house bore the unmistakable signs of a family that had stopped caring the moment the patriarch died. Rafael Herrera stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching with barely concealed contempt as Mateo approached on foot, leading Blanco down the long dirt driveway. Rafael was 43, with the thick build of someone who'd once worked hard but had recently discovered that selling things was easier than maintaining them. You actually came back, Rafael called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Thought you were just a kid with fantasies. Mateo stopped 20 feet from the porch, Blanco standing calmly beside him. I have your $18,000, Senor Herrera. Cash, like you wanted. Raphael's smirk faltered slightly. Cash? Kid, do you know how much $18,000 actually is? Without a word, Mateo opened his backpack and pulled out the bank envelope. He opened it, showing the stacks of $100 bills inside. Raphael's eyes widened. He descended the porch steps quickly, his mockery replaced by sudden greed. Where did you get that kind of money? My grandfather left it to me, for cattle breeding. Mateo held the envelope but didn't extend it yet. The papers, please. I want Blanco's registration documents, health records, and a signed bill of sale before I give you anything. Raphael licked his lips, his gaze fixed on the cash. Yeah, I got all that inside. You wait here. He disappeared into the house, returning 2 minutes later with a folder. Mateo took it, examining each document carefully while Raphael shifted impatiently. The registration papers showed Blanco's lineage, and there it was, exactly as Mateo had known it would be. Sired by Dominio, grandson of Vicente Reyes' legendary bull El Soberano. The Herreras had owned a genetic gold mine and never knew it. They'd seen the albino coat and stopped looking deeper. Everything's in order, Mateo said finally. He handed Raphael the envelope. Raphael snatched it, immediately counting the bills with the intensity of someone who didn't trust anyone. When he finished, he looked up at Mateo with something between respect and resentment. You got yourself a bull, kid. Though I still think you're crazy, that thing's worthless. Then you got a great deal, Mateo replied calmly. He picked up Blanco's lead rope. Thank you, Señor Herrera. As Mateo turned to leave, Raphael called after him, unable to resist one final jab. Good luck trying to breed him. Nobody's gonna want albino calves. You just threw away 18 grand. Mateo didn't respond. He simply walked down the driveway, Blanco following with patient, measured steps. Behind them, Rafael Herrera stood on his decaying porch, holding $18,000 and convinced he'd just swindled a foolish child. He had no idea he'd just sold the foundation of a genetic legacy that would be worth millions. But Mateo knew. His grandfather had taught him to see what others missed, to value substance over appearance, to understand that true worth often came disguised as something the ignorant would discard. As they reached the main road, Mateo stroked Blanco's white neck. Welcome home, boy. Abuelo would be so proud. Blanco made that low, rumbling sound again, the sound that seemed to say he understood, that he knew exactly how special this moment was. Together, they began the long walk back toward Mateo's grandmother's small ranch, where a new chapter of Vicente Reyes' legendary breeding program was about to begin. And behind them, in a bank in Marfa, a manager named Javier Delgado sat at his desk staring at an account record, wondering how he'd so completely misjudged a boy who carried a fortune and a dream in equal measure. 6 months passed. Marfa, Texas continued its slow rhythm. Tourists came to see the mysterious lights, artists filled the galleries, and ranchers worked their land as they had for generations. But something had shifted in the town's perception, a quiet change that rippled through coffee shop conversations and Sunday church gatherings. The boy with the albino bull had become something of a legend. Mateo's grandmother, Esperanza Reyes, had given him a corner of her modest 10-acre property to begin rebuilding what Vicente had created. With careful planning and the knowledge his grandfather had imparted, Mateo established a small but meticulous breeding operation. Blanco, dismissed by the Herreras as worthless, proved to be exactly what Mateo had known he was, a genetic treasure. Mateo bred him carefully with 3 registered cows he'd purchased from reputable breeders who understood quality over appearance. The pregnancies took, and by spring, the results began to show. The first calf was born on a cool March morning. Not albino, but carrying the gene, a massive bull calf with exceptional muscle development and a temperament so calm that even Esperanza, who'd spent 50 years around cattle, was impressed. Dios mío, she whispered, running her weathered hands over the calf's perfect conformation. Mateo, this is exactly like the calves Vicente produced in his prime. Exactly. Word spread. Professional breeders from Midland, Lubbock, and even as far as San Antonio began calling, asking about the Reyes boy with Vicente's bloodline. Mateo took their calls politely, answered their questions with the expertise of someone 3 times his age, and quietly began accepting breeding contracts. By summer, Blanco had been booked for 30 breeding contracts at $5,000 each. The bull everyone had mocked was now generating $150,000 in revenue before his calves were even weaned. At the Rio Grande Valley Bank, Javier Delgado watched Mateo's account grow with a mixture of admiration and lingering shame. The boy came in once a month, always polite, always dressed in the same simple work clothes. He'd deposit checks, review his statements with Carmen's help, and leave without fanfare. One afternoon in August, exactly 1 year after the infamous encounter, Javier approached Mateo at the ATM. "Mateo, do you have a minute?" Mateo turned, his expression neutral. "Yes, Señor Delgado." "I wanted to say, I've watched what you've built this past year. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud, and I wanted to apologize again, properly, for how I treated you that day." Mateo studied the manager for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "My abuelo used to say that a man who can admit he was wrong is worth 10 who were never tested. Thank you, Señor Delgado." They shook hands. A 12-year-old boy and a 47-year-old banker, equals in that moment. Outside, tied to the same hitching post where he'd stood a year ago, Blanco waited patiently. But now people stopped to admire him rather than mock him. Now children asked if they could pet the famous white bull. Now he was no longer a freak. He was a legend. And Mateo? He was no longer just a poor kid in duct-taped boots. He was Mateo Reyes, grandson of Vicente, keeper of a genetic legacy, and proof that sometimes the things everyone else rejects are exactly the things that change everything. 3 years later, Mateo stood in the main arena of the Fort Worth Stock Show, no longer a 12-year-old boy but a confident 15-year-old breeder. Beside him, Blanco's first son, a magnificent non-albino bull named Legado, had just won Grand Champion Bull, the highest honor in Texas cattle breeding. The prize came with $50,000 and recognition that would change Mateo's operation forever. But more importantly, it validated everything his grandfather had believed, everything he'd worked toward, everything he'd entrusted to a 10-year-old boy in a hospital room years ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "this remarkable animal represents the continuation of Vicente Reyes' legendary breeding program, now carried forward by his grandson, Mateo Reyes of Marfa, Texas." The crowd erupted in applause. In the VIP section, Esperanza wiped tears from her eyes. Beside her sat Javier Delgado, who'd become an unlikely mentor and friend, helping Mateo navigate business accounts and investments as his operation grew. After the ceremony, a journalist approached. "Mateo, everyone remembers the story of how you bought Blanco 3 years ago, the boy who walked into a bank with an albino bull and shocked everyone. What would you say to people who judge based on appearances?" Mateo smiled, glancing at Blanco, now 7 years old and still the foundation of everything he'd built. "I'd say what my abuelo taught me. Real value is rarely obvious. The things everyone else rejects are sometimes the things that matter most. You just have to be willing to see what others miss." That evening, back in Marfa, Mateo stood in the pasture watching Blanco graze peacefully among his offspring, 15 exceptional calves who carried the genetic legacy Vicente Reyes had spent a lifetime creating. The albino bull who nobody wanted had become the patriarch of a new dynasty. Mateo's phone buzzed. A text from Rafael Herrera, who'd been watching the Fort Worth broadcast. "I was wrong about that bull. Congratulations." Mateo smiled but didn't reply. Some lessons people had to learn on their own. He walked over to Blanco, resting his hand on the bull's white shoulder just as he had that first day outside the bank. "We did it, amigo. Abuelo would be so proud." Blanco made that familiar low rumble, and in the fading Texas sunset, a boy and a bull stood together, living proof that legacies aren't inherited, they're earned, and that sometimes the greatest treasures come wrapped in packages the world calls worthless. No one wanted the albino bull until a boy checked his account. The manager laughed, then saw screen.